There must be some mistake, I muttered, scrolling frantically through the document. But it was no mistake. Someone had altered my research, and not subtly. My name is Dr. Elena Marquez, and for the past 2 decades, I've dedicated my life to understanding and combating climate change. As a senior researcher at one of the world's most prestigious think tanks, I thought I was in the perfect position to make a real difference. But on that fateful day, as I stared at my computer screen in disbelief, I realized how wrong I had been. The climate models I had painstakingly developed over years of meticulous research had been twisted, their stark warnings dulled to mere suggestions. The data that clearly showed the urgent need for immediate action had been massaged into a more palatable narrative of gradual change and manageable consequences. My heart raced as I dug deeper, comparing the published report to my original findings. With each discrepancy I uncovered, a knot tightened in my stomach. This wasn't just academic dishonesty. It was a betrayal of everything I stood for, everything I had worked towards. As the full extent of the alterations became clear, a cold anger settled over me. Someone had deliberately undermined my work, and in doing so, they had potentially set back global climate action by years. I knew I couldn't let this stand, but I also knew that challenging it would come at a cost. Little did I know then just how high that cost would be, or how it would set me on a path that would change not only my life, but the future of climate science itself. The next morning, I marched into the office of Dr. Richard Hayes, the think tank's director. My hands were shaking, but my resolve was ironclad. "Richard, we need to talk about the climate report," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He looked up from his desk, his expression a mask of polite interest. "Ah, Elena, I was hoping to catch you. The board was very pleased with the report. Your work has been well received." "That's not my work," I said flatly, dropping a copy of the altered report on his desk. "Someone has changed my findings. Significantly." Richard's smile faltered for just a moment before he regained his composure. "Now, Elena, I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation. Perhaps some last-minute adjustments for clarity." "Clarity?" I couldn't keep the edge out of my voice. "Richard, they've completely changed the conclusions. The urgency has been removed, the timelines extended. This report doesn't reflect the reality of the situation at all." He leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. "Elena, you have to understand. We have stakeholders to consider. Donors who expect a certain perspective." The implication hit me like a physical blow. "Are you saying you authorized these changes?" "I'm saying that sometimes, in the interest of continued funding and support, we need to present our findings in a way that doesn't cause undue alarm." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Undue alarm? "Richard, the alarm is entirely due. We're talking about the future of our planet. And we're talking about the future of this institution," he countered, his voice taking on a steely edge. "An institution that has supported your work for 2 decades, I might add." I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. "I can't be associated with this report. It needs to be retracted and corrected." Richard's expression turned cold. "That won't be happening, Elena. The report has been published. It's done. Then I'll have to distance myself from it publicly," I said, my mind racing with the implications of what I was saying. "I wouldn't advise that," Richard said, his tone a clear warning. "It would be unfortunate for your career." As I left his office, I knew I was at a crossroads. I could stay quiet, protect my position, and watch as my life's work was twisted to serve corporate interests. Or I could fight back, risking everything I had built. In my heart, I already knew which path I would choose. The question was, how high would the price be? The weeks that followed my confrontation with Richard were a blur of anxiety and determination. I threw myself into gathering evidence, meticulously documenting every alteration made to my research. Late nights stretched into early mornings as I built my case. Fueled by a mixture of coffee and righteous anger, I reached out to colleagues I trusted, seeking advice and support. Many were sympathetic, but hesitant to get involved. "It's career suicide, Elena," one warned me. "You're going up against not just the think tank, but the entire system." But I couldn't let it go. The altered report was already being cited in policy discussions. Its watered-down conclusions, used to justify inaction on climate change. Every day that passed with this misinformation unchallenged felt like a personal failure. Finally, after weeks of preparation, I made my move. I submitted a formal complaint to the think tank's ethics committee, complete with a detailed analysis of the alterations made to my work. The response was swift and brutal. I was called into a meeting with Richard and 2 members of the board. They spoke of differences in interpretation and necessary editorial decisions. When I pushed back, citing specific data points that had been changed, the tone shifted. Dr. Marquez, one of the board members said, his voice dripping with condescension, perhaps it's time to consider whether your passion for this subject has clouded your judgment. It was clear they had no intention of addressing the real issue. Instead, they questioned my competence, my objectivity, even my mental state. By the end of the meeting, I was placed on administrative leave, pending a review of my recent work. As I packed up my office that afternoon, my former protégé, Priya, slipped in. Her eyes were wide with concern. "Elena, what's happening?" "There are rumors." I gave her a sad smile. "The rumors are probably true. I'm being pushed out." "But why? Your work is groundbreaking. The climate resilience framework you developed is being buried." I finished for her. "Priya, listen to me. Don't trust the published report. The data has been manipulated. You need to be careful." She nodded, her expression a mixture of shock and determination. "What can I do to help?" I hesitated, then made a decision. "Keep your eyes open. Document everything. And if you can, get me copies of the original data sets. I have a feeling I'm going to need them." As Priya left, promising to do what she could, I looked around my office. 20 years of work surrounded me. Awards, publications, the remnants of countless late nights and breakthroughs. And now, it was all hanging by a thread. But as I packed my belongings, a strange sense of calm settled over me. I had spent my career studying resilience in natural systems. Now, it was time to prove my own resilience. This wasn't the end, I realized. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. The following months were some of the most challenging of my life. Officially, I was on leave, but the whisper campaign against me was in full swing. Colleagues I had known for years suddenly became distant. Invitations to speak at conferences were rescinded. It felt as if my entire professional world was crumbling around me. But I wasn't alone. Priya, true to her word, became my eyes and ears within the think tank. She discreetly fed me information, confirming my worst fears about the extent of the data manipulation. It wasn't just my work. Other researchers' findings were being altered to fit a narrative that downplayed the urgency of climate action. It was during this dark time that I reconnected with Javier, an old friend from my university days, who had chosen a different path. While I had pursued academia, Javier had become an environmental activist, working at the grassroots level to push for climate action. "Elena, what they're doing to you is criminal," Javier said over coffee one day, his eyes blazing with the same passion I remembered from our student days. "But it's also an opportunity. You have the inside knowledge, the credibility. We can expose this." I sighed, running my finger around the rim of my cup. "And then what, Javier? I'll be blacklisted. No reputable institution will touch me." He leaned forward, his voice low and intense. "Maybe that's not a bad thing. The institutions are part of the problem. We need to work outside the system." His words struck a chord. I had spent my entire career working within the system, believing I could affect change from the inside. But what if Javier was right? What if the only way to make a real difference was to break free from the constraints of traditional academia and policymaking? Over the next few weeks, Javier introduced me to his network of activists, independent scientists, and ethical journalists. I was surprised to find how many shared my frustrations with the status quo. There was an entire underground movement of people working to combat climate change, free from corporate influence and political pressure. It was through this network that I met Senator Collins, a maverick politician known for her strong stance on environmental issues. When I shared my story with her, she was outraged. "Dr. Marquez, what you're describing is a deliberate attempt to mislead the public on a critical issue," she said. "We need to bring this to light." With Senator Collins' support and Javier's connections, a plan began to take shape. We would release my original unaltered research to the public, along with evidence of how it had been manipulated. But we needed to do it in a way that couldn't be ignored or easily dismissed. As we plotted and planned, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Yes, my career as I knew it might be over. But perhaps this was the path I was always meant to take. Perhaps this was how I could truly make a difference. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the foundations of climate science and policy. All we needed now was the right moment to strike. The opportunity we had been waiting for came sooner than expected. A major international climate summit was scheduled to take place in Geneva, bringing together world leaders, policymakers, and scientists to discuss global climate strategy. The think tank's altered report was slated to be a key reference point in the discussions. We knew this was our chance to make the biggest impact. With the eyes of the world on Geneva, we could ensure our revelation wouldn't be easily buried or dismissed. The night before the summit's opening ceremony, I barely slept. Years of work, months of planning, and the future of climate action all hinged on what would happen in the next 24 hours. As I dressed in the morning, choosing a suit that I hoped conveyed both professionalism and defiance, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. The woman looking back at me seemed older, wearier, but also fiercer than I remembered. "You can do this, Elena," I told my reflection. "For the planet. For the truth." The summit venue was a hive of activity when I arrived. Delegates from around the world milled about, their conversations a buzz of multiple languages. Journalists darted through the crowd, microphones at the ready. And there, at the center of it all, was Richard Hayes, holding court with a group of admirers. Our eyes met across the crowded atrium. His smile faltered for just a moment before he turned back to his audience. He thought he had silenced me. He was about to learn how wrong he was. At precisely 10 a.m., as the opening speeches were set to begin, our plan sprang into action. Simultaneously, on every screen in the venue, the live feed was replaced by a simple message. "The truth about our climate crisis has been hidden. It's time for the real data to be seen." Then my face appeared on the screens. In a pre-recorded message, I introduced myself and explained the situation. How my research had been altered, the true urgency of the climate crisis, and the evidence to back it all up. "I stand before you not as a disgruntled employee," I said in the video, "but as a scientist committed to the truth. The data doesn't lie, even when people do. And the data tells us we must act now." As my message played, members of our network distributed flash drives containing the full unaltered research to key delegates and journalists. Senator Collins, right on cue, called for an immediate press conference to address these shocking allegations of scientific malpractice. The reaction was immediate and intense. The summit erupted into chaos. Delegates huddled in urgent discussions. Journalists scrambled to break the story. And at the center of it all, Richard Hayes stood, his face ashen, as his carefully constructed narrative crumbled around him. In the midst of the frenzy, Javier found me. "Elena, you did it," he said, grinning from ear to ear. "Look at them. They can't ignore this." I nodded, feeling a mix of exhilaration and terror. "This is just the beginning," I said. "Now comes the hard part." As security personnel began to approach us, likely to escort me out, I squared my shoulders. I had spent my career studying resilience in the face of adversity. Now it was time to embody that resilience myself. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain. The truth was out there now, impossible to ignore. And I was ready to face the consequences of bringing that truth to light. The days following the Geneva revelation were a whirlwind. I found myself at the center of a global media storm, thrust into a spotlight I had never sought, but now embraced with determination. Interviews, press conferences, and debates filled my schedule. Every time I spoke, I made sure to bring the focus back to the science, to the urgent need for action. "This isn't about me," I would say. "This is about our planet, our future." The response was overwhelming. Messages of support flooded in from scientists around the world, many sharing their own stories of pressure to downplay their findings. Climate activists rallied around the unaltered data, using it to push for stronger policies and commitments. But with the support came the backlash. The think tank, scrambling to salvage its reputation, painted me as a rogue employee, unstable and unreliable. Some politicians, heavily invested in maintaining the status quo, accused me of fear-mongering. There were even veiled threats, warnings to consider the consequences of my actions. Through it all, I held firm. Every attack only strengthened my resolve. I had spent my career studying the resilience of ecosystems. Now I drew on that knowledge to fuel my own resilience. About a week after the summit, I received an unexpected call from Priya. Her voice was low, urgent. "Elena, you need to know something. I've found evidence of a direct agreement between the think tank and several major corporations. They've been funding research with predetermined outcomes for years." My mind raced with the implications. This wasn't just about my research. It was systematic corruption of scientific integrity. "Priya, this is huge. But it's also dangerous. Are you sure you want to be involved?" There was a pause before she answered, her voice firm. "I'm sure. You taught me the importance of scientific truth, Elena. I can't stand by and watch it be manipulated like this." With Priya's new information, we had the ammunition to move from defense to offense. It was time to not just protect my own research, but to challenge the entire system that had allowed this corruption to flourish. Senator Collins, who had become a staunch ally, helped us navigate the political landscape. "We need to turn this into policy change," she insisted. "It's not enough to expose the problem, we need to fix it." Together, we began drafting proposals for increased transparency in scientific funding, stronger protections for whistleblowers, and independent oversight of climate research. It was ambitious, but we knew the momentum was on our side. As we worked, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought me here. I had lost my prestigious position, my comfortable life in academia, but I had gained something far more valuable: the opportunity to fight for what I truly believed in, unencumbered by institutional constraints. One evening, as I was poring over draft legislation with Senator Collins, she looked at me with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Elena, you've started a revolution in climate science. But revolutions have costs. Are you prepared for what might come next?" I met her gaze steadily. "Senator, for years I studied the way ecosystems adapt to change. They don't just survive, they evolve. That's what we're doing now. We're evolving the way climate science interacts with policy and the public. Whatever comes next, I'm ready." As I said those words, I realized how true they were. The old Elena, the one who had believed she could change the system from within, was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone ready to challenge the status quo head-on. The fight was far from over. But for the first time in months, I felt a sense of hope. We had taken the first step towards reclaiming the integrity of climate science. Now we had to ensure that this momentum led to real, lasting change. As weeks turned into months, our movement gained momentum. What had started as a personal stand for scientific integrity had blossomed into a global campaign for transparency and action in climate research and policy. The think tank, unable to weather the storm of controversy, saw its funding and credibility evaporate. Richard Hayes resigned in disgrace, and investigations into the organization's practices were launched in multiple countries. But more importantly, the incident sparked a broader conversation about the influence of corporate interests on scientific research. With the support of Senator Collins and a growing coalition of ethical scientists and policymakers, we established a new organization, the Global Climate Truth Initiative. Our mission was twofold: to conduct and promote unbiased climate research, and to serve as a watchdog against the manipulation of scientific data. Setting up the initiative was no small feat. We faced skepticism, funding challenges, and even legal threats. But we also found allies in unexpected places: ethical investors, tech innovators, and even some forward-thinking corporations saw the value in what we were doing. Priya, who had risked her own career to support me, became a key member of our team. Her expertise and courage were invaluable as we built our organization from the ground up. "We're not just doing research," she would say. "We're changing the way research is done." As our work gained recognition, I found myself in a new role: not just a scientist, but a leader and advocate. I testified before congressional committees, spoke at international forums, and worked with journalists to ensure accurate reporting on climate issues. It was exhausting, often overwhelming, but deeply fulfilling. One particularly memorable moment came at a global climate action summit in Nairobi. As I presented our latest findings on climate resilience strategies, I looked out at the audience and saw faces from every corner of the world. Scientists, activists, policymakers, and community leaders, all united in their commitment to addressing the climate crisis. In that moment, I felt a profound sense of purpose. This was why I had taken my stand, not for personal vindication, but for this, the opportunity to drive real change, to transform the way we approach one of the greatest challenges facing humanity. After my presentation, a young researcher approached me, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "Dr. Marquez, your work inspired me to pursue climate science," she said. "How do you stay hopeful in the face of such enormous challenges?" I smiled, thinking back to the tumultuous journey that had brought me here. "Hope isn't something you find," I told her. "It's something you create. Every piece of honest research, every policy based on real data, every person who chooses to face the truth, that's what builds hope. We're not just studying resilience, we're practicing it." As I looked around at the bustling conference, at the energy and determination that filled the room, I felt a surge of optimism. We had a long way to go in addressing the climate crisis, but we were on the right path. We were facing the challenge with open eyes and honest data. The old system, built on compromise and concealment, was crumbling. In its place, we were building something new, a framework for climate action based on transparency, integrity, and unwavering commitment to the truth. There would be more battles ahead, more challenges to face. But standing there, surrounded by fellow warriors for climate truth, I knew we were ready. Whatever came next, we would face it together, armed with the most powerful weapon of all, uncompromising truth. 5 years after the Geneva Revelation, I stood at the podium of the United Nations General Assembly, preparing to address world leaders on the state of global climate action. The journey to this moment had been long and often difficult, but as I looked out at the assembled delegates, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. Our Global Climate Truth Initiative had become a respected voice in international climate discussions. Our research was cited in policy decisions around the world, and our advocacy had helped shape a new era of transparency in climate science. But more than that, we had sparked a cultural shift. The public demand for honest, unfiltered climate data had grown exponentially. Citizen science initiatives flourished, with people around the world contributing to and engaging with climate research in unprecedented ways. As I began my speech, I reflected on the transformation that had taken place, not just in the world of climate science, but in myself. "Distinguished delegates," I said, my voice steady and clear. 5 years ago, I stood against a system that prioritized comfort over truth. Today, I stand before you as a representative of a new approach to facing our climate reality. An approach based on unwavering commitment to scientific integrity and an understanding that our greatest strength in the face of this crisis is our unity. I went on to present our latest findings, data that showed both the accelerating impacts of climate change and the promising results of coordinated global action. The numbers were stark, the challenges immense, but for the first time, I saw real engagement in the eyes of the world leaders before me. "We stand at a crossroads," I concluded. "The path ahead is difficult, but it is illuminated by the light of shared knowledge and collective determination. We have the tools, we have the data, and most importantly, we have each other. Let us move forward together, guided by truth and driven by hope." As applause filled the chamber, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Priya, now the head of our research division. "We've come a long way," she said, her eyes glistening. "We have," I agreed. "But we're just getting started." Later that evening, at a reception overlooking the New York skyline, I found a quiet moment to reflect. The lights of the city below mirrored the stars above, a reminder of the delicate balance we were fighting to preserve. Javier joined me, handing me a glass of champagne. "To the uncompromising truth," he said, raising his glass. I smiled, clinking my glass against his. "And to those who dared to speak it." As we stood there, looking out at the city and the sky beyond, I thought about the long journey that had brought me here. The fear and uncertainty of those early days seemed distant now, replaced by a deep-seated confidence in the power of scientific truth and collective action. I thought of all the people who had joined our cause over the years: scientists, activists, policymakers, and ordinary citizens from every corner of the globe. Each of them had, in their own way, chosen truth over comfort, action over apathy. The challenges ahead were still immense. The climate crisis was far from solved, but we had built a foundation of honesty and collaboration that I believed could weather any storm. As the night wore on and colleagues gathered around to discuss next steps and new initiatives, I felt a renewed surge of energy. This was not an ending, but a continuation. Every breakthrough, every policy change, every mind open to the reality of our climate situation. These were not final victories, but steps on an ongoing journey. The path forward would not be easy. There would be setbacks, opposition, and new challenges we couldn't yet foresee. But we had proven that truth, spoken with courage and backed by uncompromising science, had the power to change the world. As I looked out at the horizon, where the lights of the city met the darkness of the ocean, I made a silent promise. To the planet, to future generations, and to myself. We would keep pushing forward. We would keep speaking truth to power. We would never stop fighting for a future where science, policy, and public action aligned to address the greatest challenge of our time. The journey that had begun with a single act of defiance had transformed into a global movement. And in that transformation, I had found my true purpose, not just as a scientist, but as a guardian of truth, a voice for our planet, and a catalyst for change. The new horizon before us was daunting, but it was also filled with possibility. Armed with honest data, global collaboration, and unwavering determination, we were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As the first light of dawn began to break over the city, I smiled. Another day, another opportunity to push forward, to speak truth, to make a difference. The work continued, and I was ready.